not a coincidence. 3 divine signs that God is removing the wrong person from your life. I recently faced the agonizing decision to remove someone from my life, and just before I pressed that final send on the message, I froze. Confusion gripped me. 5 months had passed, and I was still entangled in indecision. Psychologists note that this paralysis is not uncommon, what they call approach avoidance conflict, where the desire to protect oneself clashes with feelings of guilt or obligation. The stress of keeping this person in my life was driving me toward emotional exhaustion, yet the very thought of setting boundaries filled me with shame, as if I were doing something morally wrong. It's enough to make anyone curl up, tearful and defeated. Clinically, this response is tied to empathetic overarousal, where highly empathetic individuals feel the weight of responsibility for the emotional consequences of their choices, even when the other person is toxic. To understand why letting go feels so excruciating, consider the metaphor of Donna. Donna's hair is dead, brittle, yet she clings to it as if it's part of her identity. Psychologists often compare this to the human tendency to hold onto what is familiar, even if harmful, a phenomenon called status quo bias. Walking away from a toxic person is like cutting off dead hair, necessary for growth, yet emotionally terrifying. The mind protests, clinging to the familiar pain because it feels safer than the unknown freedom. To move forward, the victim must cultivate discernment and trust, not in themselves alone, but in the higher guidance of what psychologists call external moral frameworks. In this case, spiritual discernment, as it provides the anchor needed to overcome fear of the unknown. The single greatest barrier to recognizing when someone is meant to be removed from your life is mental clutter. Not literal clutter, but the constant swirl of shoulds and shouldn'ts. She apologized, but she's family, but I shouldn't feel this way. But cognitive psychologists note that this pattern is called cognitive rumination, where repetitive thoughts about obligations and moral judgments trap individuals in cycles of indecision and guilt. It creates emotional paralysis, keeping the toxic influence alive and prolonging suffering. Healing begins when you recognize that the shoulds and shouldn't serve no one. They are the weeds in your mental garden, feeding the narcissist's control by tethering your emotions to their behavior. So how do you know when it's time to cut someone loose? The first sign is unmistakable. They're poisoning your garden. Imagine tending a beautiful garden when a sudden weed erupts, prickly, aggressive, spreading fast. You touch it and wince. It threatens everything healthy in your space. Psychologists often use the metaphor of a toxic relational weed to describe people who consistently lie, shame, manipulate, or sabotage. These individuals are not merely inconvenient. They erode your psychological resilience, leaving emotional bruises that fester over time. Research in social psychology highlights that repeated exposure to such toxic interactions can increase stress hormones, impair cognitive function, and even trigger depressive or anxiety disorders in the victim. The strategy? Pull the weeds out early. Setting firm boundaries or removing the toxic individual protects your mental, emotional, and even physical health, because ignoring the problem only allows the poison to spread. The second sign emerges more subtly. They distort your reality. Narcissistic and toxic individuals are masterful at twisting facts, emotions, and perceptions, making you doubt yourself. Psychologists describe this as gaslighting, a form of psychological manipulation where the victim begins to question their memory, perception, and even sanity. You say, "You hurt me when you took money from the account without telling me." And they respond with a cascade of rationalizations and blame shifting, turning your justified frustration into an accusation against you. This constant recalibration of reality creates chronic stress and diminishes self-trust. For victims, the therapeutic path involves validation from trusted sources, journaling, and cognitive restructuring, techniques that help distinguish the distorted narrative from truth, restoring clarity and self-confidence. The third sign is often the hardest to see because it's disguised as care or manipulation through intermittent reinforcement. Toxic individuals will oscillate between acts of kindness and harm, creating a trauma bond, a psychological attachment reinforced by unpredictability. You may recall moments of charm, generosity, or connection, which psychologists identify as part of the narcissist's strategic behavior to maintain control. Over time, this roller coaster produces heightened emotional dependency, making separation feel impossible despite clear evidence of harm. Recovery requires structured disengagement, cultivating self-compassion, limiting contact, and leaning on supportive networks to break the cycle and reclaim autonomy. Finally, understanding divine timing or any guiding moral framework can complement psychological insight. Trusting that the process of removing toxic influences is part of a greater design alleviates the pressure of perfection. Psychologists note that surrendering control to a trusted external framework reduces decision fatigue and internalized guilt, allowing victims to act decisively. When combined with clinical strategies like boundary setting, assertive communication, and emotional self-regulation, this creates a powerful synergy for healing. Recognizing these signs, the poison garden, the distorted reality, the intermittent reinforcement, is the first step toward liberation. But awareness alone is not enough. It must be coupled with courageous action. Pulling out the weeds, trusting your discernment, and severing toxic ties is a radical act of self-preservation. As psychologists emphasize, recovery is not just about removing the toxic individual. It is about rebuilding psychological safety, emotional autonomy, and self-respect. Only then can you experience the peace and clarity that has been waiting for you all along. When someone in your life seems vibrant, supportive, or healthy one moment, only to prick, wound, or confuse you the next, it's not merely inconsistency. It's a red flag that something deeper is at play. Psychologists describe this as emotional unpredictability, often a hallmark of manipulative or toxic relationships. The oscillation between warmth and harm creates a subtle but persistent psychological strain known as intermittent reinforcement, which neuropsychologists note can increase attachment to the person even as they hurt you. This pattern is not harmless. It erodes trust, destabilizes your emotional equilibrium, and keeps you tethered to someone who cannot contribute to your growth. As the metaphor goes, a weed in your garden may look lively at first, but left unchecked, it will choke out the life of the plants you are trying to nurture. Spiritually and psychologically, the lesson is clear. Removing toxic individuals is essential not only for your peace, but for your flourishing. 1 Corinthians 15 verse 33 reminds us that bad company corrupts good morals, echoing what psychologists call social contagion. Our behaviors, moods, and thought patterns are influenced by the people we surround ourselves with. The second sign comes subtly, yet powerfully, a shift in feelings. Perhaps you've been comfortable in the relationship, but suddenly your feelings toward this person sour, or their feelings toward you seem to change. Emotional psychologists point out that such shifts often reflect underlying dynamics of boundary violation, unacknowledged resentment, or the creeping awareness of manipulation. Feelings alone shouldn't dictate decisions. After all, emotions can be fickle, but they are often a barometer signaling that your relational ecosystem is out of balance. Spiritually, this aligns with the biblical narrative of Exodus 7, where God hardened Pharaoh's heart. Romans 9 verse 17 underscores that even what feels externally harsh can serve a divine purpose. In psychological terms, these shifts are your subconscious registering harm, signaling the need for protective action. The combination of intuition and emotional response is not irrational. It's a survival mechanism, a warning light that requires attention rather than suppression. The third sign is one that many people tragically ignore. God removed them before, but you let them back in. From a psychological perspective, this is often a replay of learned helplessness or maladaptive attachment, where past patterns of surrender, forgiveness, or misplaced empathy lead to repeated exposure to harm. The rational mind may say, "They apologized, we had good times, I feel lonely." But trauma psychologists note that these justifications are often emotionally driven rather than evidence-based, fueled by nostalgia or a fear of being alone. Scripture reminds us that fruit reveals true character. In psychological terms, consistent behavior over time demonstrates reliability and emotional safety. A toxic person may claim transformation, but without observable change in behavior, trusting them is like planting a supposedly healthy sapling in poisoned soil. It may look good temporarily, but the roots of dysfunction remain. This is where emotional wisdom becomes crucial. Psychologists highlight that victims of toxic relationships often overestimate their own judgment when distressed. Emotional arousal clouds decision-making, leading to repeated exposure to harmful patterns. Spiritual guidance, trusting that God is orchestrating removal for your benefit, functions as an external anchor, reinforcing cognitive clarity and encouraging decisive action. The hardest part is surrendering control, acknowledging that your desire to reintegrate the toxic person is not a reflection of God's will, but a reaction rooted in your own emotional needs. Boundaries, in this context, are both protective and empowering. Setting them is not a betrayal. It is an assertion of your right to emotional and psychological safety. Finally, the intersection of psychological insight and spiritual discernment offers a roadmap to recovery. Understanding the signs, emotional inconsistency, shifting feelings, and the temptation to reinvite previously removed toxic individuals is critical, but acting on them requires courage. Therapists emphasize the importance of education, boundary setting, and social support. Engaging with resources like the Toxic People Survival Guide equips you to recognize manipulative dynamics, respond with assertive clarity, and maintain separation when necessary. Spiritually, acknowledging divine timing and purpose provides resilience against guilt or second-guessing. Psychologically, removing harmful individuals allows your mind and heart to rebuild, cultivating a relational environment where growth, trust, and peace are possible. In the end, recognizing God's intervention and combining it with psychological insight is not merely about avoiding harm. It is about reclaiming your life, your autonomy, and your ability to flourish without the constant interference of someone who cannot contribute to your well-being. Knowledge, discernment, and courage become your tools. Awareness alone is not enough. Decisive action rooted in both faith and evidence-based insight is what ensures that the toxic influence no longer holds sway over your life.